Some see as anti-Chinese remarks made by the Australian Prime Minister. Where are Sino-Australian relations heading in the future? And after Chinese President Xi Jinping made it very clear that China would neither import other countries' models nor export its own, what exactly is the Chinese Communist Party's philosophy in its relationship with foreign governments? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Cheng. Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull vehemently denied in an ABC News program on Monday that he or his government is anti-Chinese. This comes just 2 days after he used both English and Chinese to say that the Australian people have stood up to China. This whole drama started last week when the Australian government proposed a crackdown on foreign interference in political activity. The Prime Minister stressed the laws would not target any one country, but noted recent disturbing reports of Chinese influence in Australian politics. China is strongly dissatisfied with those remarks and has lodged stern representations with the Australian side. So how should we understand Australia's foreign policy towards China now? And after 45 years of good diplomatic relations, where is bilateral ties or bilateral relationship going in the future? Joining me today in the studio are Professor Zheng Wei, a Chinese Australian who now lives in Beijing, and Xu Qingduo, a current affairs commentator. Gentlemen, welcome to the studio. Before we start the discussion, shall we take a listen to exactly what Prime Minister Turnbull said? Here it is.
Modern China was founded in 1949 with these words: Zhongguo Renmin Zanqi Lai. The Chinese people have stood up. It was an assertion of sovereignty. It was an assertion of pride. And we stand up. And so we say, Adalia Renmin Zanqi Lai. The Australian people stand up.
So, Qingduo, help us understand the circumstances of why he said that the Australian people have stood up. For what? Against what?
Well, he's trying to justify, what this political rhetoric in Australia. Basically, we see it as like anti-China, very much anti-China in the media, and also remarks by the politician in a very irresponsible way. Of course, it's a domestic politics, it's a retail politics, the election politics between this Liberal Party against the Liberal Party in the opposition. But the thing is, like, they are doing it at the expense of this relationship with China. So he's obviously being criticized for, are you anti-China, anti-Chinese? He's trying to explain. In 1949, the Chinese said that, Chinese people have stood up. The things like the circumstances are different. At that time, after 100 years of humiliation, yes, Chinese people stand up. But here, Australia basically saying that, I'm defending the national interests of Australia. I'm there to stand up in front of China.
Against the Chinese.
Against the Chinese. Yeah. So the message is totally different.
Sure. Professor Zheng Wei, from your understanding, what kind of message will it send to the Australian audience when you hear the Prime Minister saying the Australians have stood up?
He used the word sovereignty and pride to explain his stand, and I agree with my fellow commentator that this is inappropriate to China. When Chairman Mao used the sentence that Chinese people have stood up, it's against the background of open war 100 years prior to that,
invasion,
8 years Japanese occupation, and the Civil War. A lot of lives has been lost, and whatever the difference and the conflict or friction we have, it's not to that magnitude. To my understanding, he's doing that with two things in his mind. The Liberal Party is running a regional election, Benelong, and the Liberal Party is head-to-head, neck-to-neck with the Labour Party. And this is the government with a majority of one. And he's a bit tense. And it's no coincidence that 1 day ago that he was quoted saying, do not focus on 30 political polls. That shows that Labour Party is losing. So he's a bit tense. And
with domestic politics in mind as well.
So he wants to win, he wants to survive.
So, this is very interesting. I just want to give our audience maybe who have not followed this very closely a very quick timeline. This basically started on December the 5th, right, on Tuesday, when the Australian government proposed 3 new bills, one of them against foreign interference in Australian politics, on espionage and on the prohibition of foreign political donations to Australian parties. And then on December the 6th, the Chinese embassy in Canberra actually put out a very strong worded statement calling the kind of anti-China hysteria and Cold War mentality within some Australians. And then the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson also made a similar reaction towards the bias that have been present in Australian media. And then Prime Minister Turnbull said what he said, that the Australian government stood up. And then, however, on Monday, which is yesterday, Prime Minister Turnbull went on Australian TV, ABC News, and denied that his government is anti-Chinese. Xu Qingduo, how shall we look at Mr. Turnbull's stance on China? Is he friendly? Is he anti-China?
He tried very hard to deny that he's anti-Chinese. He even, used the example of one of the million Chinese or with Chinese descendants living in Australia. That's his granddaughter. So like, I'm the yeye of my granddaughter. How can I be anti-Chinese? But remember, there's a difference: anti-Chinese, anti-China. Slightly difference here.
What is he?
I think, based on his rhetoric, based on his policy, I wouldn't doubt that there's anti-China attitudes and
even
Chinese
rhetoric,
government,
the Chinese
but not to the Chinese community, because he's trying to win the votes in this Panama. There's like 16 to 20% of the population, they are Chinese. So that's why he tried so hard to explain, no, I'm not anti-Chinese. I want your votes.
However, I was listening to a speech he was giving about 5 years ago when he talked about China, and he was very cool-headed then. He said when you're dealing with China, you need to be very cool-headed, you need to be pragmatic, and he acknowledged that China does not want to export its values or its political systems to other countries. So he said that very rational words. Professor Zheng, do you think Prime Minister Turnbull has changed?
I think he's changed in his position because he's a Prime Minister now. As a person, he has to fit in the role. This instance, in my opinion, is a culmination of what happened prior to that recently. There's a white paper, there's Bishop's declaration on the South China Sea, there is quadrilateral dialogues between US, Australia, India and Japan. Australia sort of rejoined it recently. So this sort of set the tone to their foreign policy, and probably he felt obliged to follow that political line.
But exactly why such anxiety against the choice between China and the United States?
This has been probably the biggest foreign policy issue for Australia over the past 10 to 15 years. That's whether Australia should make a choice between China, the ATM, and the United States, the bodyguard of Australia. So the biggest trading partner make money out of China relationship here. And the thing is there's no clear choice. So the Australian policy has been like we don't need to make a choice. But the things China, as China continues to rise, and as the United States, especially this year, when the Donald Trump administration took office, remember, the retreating sort of, from the global affairs, giving up the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Australia feel increasingly the anxiety. They are not sure, they are not certain of the future. Increasingly, if you based on some of the remarks by Australian analysts, hey, here is the game between China and the United States. China has won the game. Australia has to make a choice. If you're living in the region somehow dominated by the Chinese, what we are going to do? They are refusing basically to make a choice, to even embrace the reality. They think the reality is too tough for them to accept. So they feel this anxiety, this uncertainty that can be reflected in their rhetorics, in some of the policies.
Professor Zheng, your take on this question?
I absolutely agree. Currently, this is unprecedented. As Mr. Turnbull himself admitted, for the first time, your military alliance is not your biggest trading partner. Only Australian government and Australian people can determine how to deal with that. But while the relationship, or trading relationship and business is good between China and Australia, as Australian Chinese, I hope we keep on cooperate and put the difference aside and have a win-win situation.
Sure. I mean, what I do not understand, however, is that, as we said, China is the largest trading partner for Australia, and it's been several years, right, almost 10 years. And however, the kind of mistrust seems to have grown deeper. Why is that?
You're right, actually, especially this year. You see basically the whole year-long media coverage, negative media coverage, some of them based on allegations, some of them are purely fabricated stories about the Chinese infiltration, Chinese intervention, political intervention in Australia. I would sometimes say, come on, you know, Australia is only a blip in the strategic map of the Chinese, and you don't overestimate the importance of yourself. I'm sorry, 24 million people is not a big country. I can be very blunt to that. The thing is, like, if you look at their remarks by the foreign minister back in March, Julia Bishop says she made this public statement basically accusing the Chinese political system of being a bad political system. They say if China continues with this political system, China will not be fully develop its economic potential. How can you make such a statement about another country's political system? Besides, nobody is in a position, because China has been so successful, the most successful country over the past 40 years in terms of economic and social construction. And also, back in June, the Shangri-La meeting in Singapore, and Turnbull, Prime Minister Turnbull made a keynote speech, and that speech is the most anti-China, the most unfriendly to China. He basically related China to words like coercion, intimidation, and these kind of words. This is the Chinese behavior.
Well, if they made up their mind that this is the path they're going to follow, well, they have to feel the pain themselves until probably they can change their mind.
You're right. The mistrust from the Australian side, because of the media, because of the political talks, obviously is growing. But the same is true in China. There's a criticism from Australian side, attack against the Chinese. Then there's the Chinese awareness of somehow, wow, Australia is so unfriendly, so hostile to the Chinese, to China.
They don't understand. We don't understand where
we also have a mistrust of Australia.
Sure. Right now, the Chinese people are asking why such a beautiful land, such nice people, why they hate us so much. Anyway, thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Professor Zheng Wei and Shi Qingduo, a current affairs commentator. And here is my last point. Now, this year marks the 45th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and Australia. During that time, bilateral ties have, by and large, developed steadily. China has become Australia's largest trading partner and investor. The free trade agreement between the two countries has also enabled greater trade, cultural and people-to-people exchanges, bringing concrete benefits to both peoples. The spat, however, between the two sides have shown the fear and anxiety in ideology-hardened Australian minds about China's rise. And if you choose to look at certain objects through the lens of ideology, even a stone would appear red. China welcomes the Australian government's stance, as stated in the latest government white paper, that the sustained development of China's economy is an important opportunity for Australia, and Australia is committed to a strong and constructive, comprehensive strategic relationship with China. The Chinese people would also like to believe that Prime Minister Turnbull really meant it when he said he was not anti-China, because hostility or hysteria against China would not make Australia great, but rather hurt the interests of the Australian people and the Chinese people. You're watching The Point. I'll be back right after this. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lu Cheng said in a press briefing on Monday that certain people in quite a few Western countries have been interested in whether other countries will interfere in their internal affairs. He added that non-interference is one of the basic norms governing international relations enshrined in the UN Charter. Chinese President Xi Jinping made it very clear at the first ever dialogue between the CPC and world political parties earlier this month that China will not import other countries' models, nor will China export its model. What is the CPC's philosophy in its foreign policies, and how to better understand China's stance to prevent such political dramas? I caught up with Li Cheng, Director and Senior Fellow with the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. I started by asking him why President Xi stressed that China will not import or export political models.
Well, there's some misunderstandings in the outside world, especially in the West or United States. They interpreted the 19th Party Congress in a way that China emphasized socialism with Chinese characteristics, and they even think that China now found its own model, and whatever the Western scholars try to define. And but I have a different interpretation compared with my colleagues. I always argue that rule of law is not China's tradition, which is emphasized in 19th Party Congress. Does not mean that China wants to resist, the foreign influences, and but rather to embrace the good things, the merits, the valuable things from outside the world, including from the West. But at the same time,
Marxism came from the West.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that is more to do with the Western interpretation. They interpreted the 19th Party Congress reflect China's determination to export China model. I did not see that language. So I'm very happy that the President Xi Jinping used this occasion to clarify. He said you cannot find a more clearer language like what Xi Jinping did, talk about that China has no intention to export a China model. And actually this has been consistent. China always say that each country has its own unique social, political, historical, cultural background, and each country's development should be different. I think that view actually could be well received in the international community, including the West, because after all, diversity, respect diversity, pluralism is part of the so-called Western value. I think it's a universal value in that regard. So certainly China has a good point to emphasize.
And China has been talking about or promoting this idea of building a community, a shared future for mankind. This seems to be a very big, very lofty idea, difficult to grasp. What implication will it have if countries really put their efforts into this and do something about it? Do you think this is really going to benefit people in other parts of the world?
Oh, I think it's a good idea. It's a good concept. And it's similar to the English expression, we are in the same boat, because the world faces some
But this seems to be common sense. Why do we need to emphasize it? I mean, what is it trying to counter?
We should put in the context. Many people in the West think that China wants to challenge the existing international system, current international order, to create its own kind of a development model or its own system or its own norm. This is really not true. Chinese leaders mentioned in many occasions in so many international meetings and also bilateral dialogue with foreign countries emphasize that's not China's intention. China is a beneficiary of the economic globalization, and China may want to improve the international order or system, contribute in its own way, but there's no kind of plan, try to replace it. So because why? Because we, in some fundamental interests, we share anti-terrorism, nuclear non-proliferation, cybersecurity, and also that in terms of refugees issue, peacekeeping, and environment protection, and name it. I mean, most importantly is the stability of the economic and financial institutions in today's world. Now, China wanted to maybe improve. I think in certain areas we do need to reform, and we should, major powers should also pay more attention to other countries' development. To a certain extent, One Belt, One Road emphasize on infrastructure development. So it's like AIIB, it's a supplement, not a replacement about the World Bank or Asia Development Bank, because these development banks usually concentrate on poverty reduction, but not so much for infrastructure development, because infrastructure development could really change the life and give the opportunity. In China, you ask any village head, during the reform period over the past 30 years, I mean, he or she will tell that the village become rich not because they become rich, they build the road or transportation system, but rather they build a road, then their village become rich. So it's an emphasis on infrastructure development can lead to, you know, improved life and etc. So that China, that's a part of the reason China has the economic miracle, and China wanted to share that experience and want to help these developing countries, you know, in the One Belt One Road area. I think there's nothing wrong with that plan. I certainly applaud, but of course it's still the early stage, and there are some problems China needs to fix, the countries need to fix, but overall idea is not bad.
Well, if you also look at some Western reports, there are, I think, to a certain extent, people do not really understand the idea. Why does the CPC want to have this dialogue with world political parties and emphasizing the potential need to institutionalize that kind of dialogue?
Well, again, this is only one of the many meetings over the past 2 or 3 years that China hosts the international nature, whether it be economic affairs, whether it be environment, whether it be security, and like the Wuzhen conferences on the cyber security, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization emphasizes on anti-terrorism in Central Asia, and One Belt One Road on the economic development, and you know, the BRICS talk about the emerging market.
What is China trying to do with all of these meetings, with all of these documents and declarations? Is China trying to do something, you know, putting all of these together?
Well, it's all related to the fact that China now it want to moving to the center stage. And China does not want to be a global leader, at least based on what we have read. But China wants to be an important player. And China does not want to set up the rules by itself, but it should be in the decision-making process because of China's growing power. When you have this economic success, when you have so many countries look at China as the future, particularly in South America and Africa, I mean, naturally, you want to use that capital, you want to use these resources to do something good. Now, I do believe that China thus far, in many ways, contribute to peace and prosperity and also security around the world. Not like some people so critical talk about China's threat. China wants to replace the international system, cause chaotic things. I think it's important to know China is a part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Last question. A report I was reading by Bloomberg calling the efforts of this dialogue, China's efforts to get as many leaders of world's political parties to come and sign a document to endorse President Xi as a peacemaker. What is your take on that?
Well, I do not see that way. And certainly that in many ways that Western countries also think that Xi Jinping is a wonderful leader, and Donald Trump said that publicly. So why you do not talk about what Donald Trump said, what the other world leaders said, what like Time magazine also consider him as one of the most influential figures, I mean, last year and etc. And so just single out that to come to praise him, I do not read that way. I think this is respect for China, respect for China's convening power, and certainly Xi Jinping in his 5 years first term did a lot of good things for China, and also you can see for the world. His participation in the nuclear non-proliferation, and Donald Trump even praised him in that regard. And he initiated One Belt One Road. And also
peacekeeping forces abroad?
Absolutely. China now all of a sudden become important, and China become kind of a major player in climate change and made a commitment. What's wrong with that? And finally, in the financial economic stability, I mean, all these areas domestically are also surprised so many of us with a very strong anti-corruption campaign with very successful military reform. So these are good for China, should also good for the region.
1/5 of humanity.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's not a trivial thing. And we should really see that, people can have different views. You can be concerned, worried. I mean, China will continue to, I hope, that convince outside the world that China will not cause problem, will be a positive, constructive force. But some people already see China in that light. And I'm not saying all of these people come to the party meetings, but rather that they find, Chinese Communist Party, there must be some mechanism. Actually, my research made the same argument. I think, yes, China is a one-party state, but the Chinese Communist Party probably more dynamic, more effective than we thought. I mean, you look at the turnover rate of the Central Committee members. On average, since 1982, is about 62%. If you reduce those from the number or percentage from the ordinary member to Central Committee member, will be 10% roughly less. So still 50% every 5 years. This time it's 76% of the Central Committee members are new. If you exclude from the alternate promoted full member, it's 65. And also you look at the anti-corruption body, it's 93% new members.
Yeah, it's really unimaginable even for many Western parties who pride themselves for this
Yes.
kind of turnover of new members,
Yeah.
replacing old members. Anyway, we're running out of time. Thank you so much, Dr. Li Cheng, Director and Senior Fellow from John Thornton China Center, the Brookings Institution. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Li Cheng. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Follow me on Facebook or Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.